You've just entered the Storyteller.net Amphitheater.
Amphitheater.
Suddenly the other becomes no longer the other. But
Right.
something you can understand.
Right.
Whatever that other may be, whatever the barrier may be.
This is Sean Buvala with the Small Tooth Dog Publishing Group in Arizona. I am the publisher, and I'm speaking today to Laura Packer, who is the author of a book that is upcoming or may already be released when you hear this. And that book is From Audience to Zeal, The ABCs of Finding, Crafting, and Telling a Great Story. This is interesting to me as I was editing this, and I know this to be true because of my experience, but I want to kind of hang a lantern on it. So much of what's in the book, writing about oral storytelling, is about the relationships between the performer and the audience. We talk about this like crazy in the oral storytelling world in particular, even more so than the written stories. So why? Why is this so important, and why is this so central to a lot of what we're writing in this book?
My first thought is a little bit snarky, but that doesn't make it untrue, which is, as storytellers, our audience is in our face.
Yeah.
And they're right there.
Right.
And many storytellers, myself included, choose to tell their stories very much in the moment and in a very present way, not as if it's a theatrical experience, but engaging the audience. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm talking to the audience or making the audience do anything other than listen, but I am acutely aware of the audience and their response to what I'm saying. So there's no fourth wall, to borrow that theatrical term. It isn't as though I'm pretending the audience isn't there at any point. So because of that, the audience is part of the creative work, is part of the creative process. If I'm telling a story where the audience seems to really be enjoying the descriptions of the deep, dark wood, I may spend a moment or two in that deep, dark wood than I would with an audience who looks patently bored by it. And I think that for all storytellers, it is crucial that we remember that our audience is part of the creative process. I think that a great deal of art could be enhanced by remembering that the audience is in the room, particularly any kind of performance. Writing as well. I think gamers, actually, people who design games, pay a lot of attention to what their audience wants.
Oh, yeah.
And their response.
Yeah.
There are ways in which I think modern gaming is probably as close to storytelling as we currently have in any kind of mediated form. I think that storytellers spend so much time talking about it because we cannot escape from it. A writer can create their piece in the solitude of their office or wherever it may be. A dancer can become so deeply invested in their choreography and their interaction with the other dancers on the stage that they may not have the mental energy to expend to pay attention to the audience. But as storytellers, we say something and we listen for our audience's response, whether it's a laugh or a sigh or a sniff, or that imperceptible shifting when they're a little bored or when they get a break. I think the best storytellers are always aware of their audiences and how the audience is responding. And as I said with Brother Blue, it is like a pas de deux. It's a dance. It's a dance between the teller and the audience all the time, always responding. Does that help?
It does. Can you think of a time, we say this as storytelling performers and preachers and teachers and healers and all the other things we are, that the audience changes the experience of storytelling. Can you think of a time when a direct audience interaction changed the story you were doing?
I was performing at a festival, and I was in a fairly small tent. I think it seated maybe 300 people, 400 people, which at that festival was small.
Right.
And this was marketed as an all ages performance, which what that often is code for is bring your kids and leave them there. That's what it's all about. So there were some boys who were 8 or 9 years old, maybe a little older, who had been dropped off by a parent and were lying on the ground in the front row playing video games.
Right.
And it was very loud and very disruptive. And the other audience members were having trouble concentrating. And I think they really wanted to. I think they wanted to hear the stories. So shaming the boys wasn't going to do any good. They'd just go and tell their parents, and then their parents would complain about the mean storyteller.
Right.
Asking them to stop would function the same way.
Right.
So no matter how nicely I would ask them. So what I ended up doing is at a reasonable break in the story, I said to the audience, hey, hang on a sec. I want to know what these guys are doing. And so I asked them to tell me about their game. And then I said to them, and I did this on stage. I brought them up on stage, and they were of the age, fortunately, where being on stage was kind of exciting and not that uncomfortable for them.
Right, yeah.
And so the audience was watching, and I think some of the audience didn't know what I was doing, but very quickly they figured out that what I was doing was trying to get these boys engaged. And so I asked them to tell me about the games. They did, and I said, hey, do you mind if I finish telling my story and you can keep the games quiet for a few minutes, because I think there's some parts you might like coming up. And so then the boys sat down, and I was able to weave in elements from their game that they had told me about in the 90 seconds that it took them to tell me about the game into the story. And then the boys were engaged. They put the games down. The rest of the audience was no longer disturbed. And some of the audience thought, wow, that's kind of neat, the way that she brought this all together, because I had to change the story midstream to get their video game elements woven in. It wasn't that hard. It involved just changing a character a little bit.
Right.
But it was a way to, without shaming, embarrassing, telling anyone what they were bad or anything like that, a way to invite these children into this collective experience, and a way to show the other audience members that the kids were just being kids and just needed that open door. But I can tell you that, and this is something I reference in Audience to Zeal, I have a story that I tell about feeling suicidal. And the story is framed as kind of a magical realism tale. Mm-hmm. But it is certainly based on personal experience when I was in a very dark time. Almost every time I tell that story, someone comes up to me and says, I never knew anyone else felt that way. To a point where if I know that I'm going to have that story in my set, I jot down the number for 1-800-SUICIDE on a couple little cards that I can give to people.
Right.
I've had people contact me months, if not years later, and tell me that that story was the trigger that helped them, that led them to get help. So while the story itself hasn't changed, the way that I tell it has changed, because I am alert for the audience's response and for what I might need to do, how I might need to respond. And that, again, I think is about the power of story, because the story uses metaphorical language, since there are elements of magical realism in it. I think it's easier for people who might be having a rough time to identify with it than if I just stood up there and said, well, there was this time when I was about to jump off a bridge, which is something very different.
I've been speaking to Laura Packer, who is the author of the new book from the Small Tooth Dog Publishing Group. The book is From Audience to Zeal, the ABCs of Finding, Crafting, and Telling a Great Story. I think we've covered a lot in this first session, and we plan on having another session here very soon. I think we've covered a lot of material in here. Is there anything on this session that you want to either look at again or make a quick comment on? Is there anything, Laura, that you want to kind of wrap this first session up with?
I just want to underscore that storytelling is an accessible art. We may not all end up being stage performers, but we all use storytelling in our everyday lives to connect more deeply with the world and the people around us. And Audience to Zeal is designed to help you, no matter where you are as a storyteller, to become more effective and more comfortable with what you're doing.
My guest today has been Laura Packer from Audience to Zeal, the ABCs of Finding, Crafting, and Telling a Great Story. I have been and I remain Sean Buvala, who is the publisher of the Small Tooth Dog Publishing Group, LLC, in Arizona. Thanks for listening to us today. If you would like to find more information about Laura's upcoming book, or perhaps even out there in the world already, go to audiencetozeal.com, audiencetozeal.com. You can pick the book up in most of the standard places you can buy books. You can also buy it directly from the Small Tooth Dog Publishing Group online in our secure store.
You've been listening to the Storyteller.net Amphitheater. All rights reserved. No part or whole may be reproduced in any manner for any reason without the express written permission of Storyteller.net.